United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
Quite something. The United States has finally decided to open a relationship with Cuba and try to repair what has been broken for decades. President Barack Obama, as you saw, announced today that apparently with the help of Pope Francis and indeed the Canadian government, started a new policy towards the communist state. President of the Hamilton Foundation and former Bush State Department senior advisor, Christian Whitten, joins us now from Los Angeles. Are you rejoicing at this?
No, I'm not. Unfortunately, I think it's a terrible move. And, you know, the president's very first sentence was incorrect. We're not changing how we relate to the Cuban people. We're changing how we relate to the Cuban government. And those are two very different things.
Why this obsession with a very small, relatively unimportant state? I mean, you have strong alliances with some of the worst theocracies and dictatorships in the entire world.
Well, Cuba does some things that are very, very unhelpful, not just on human rights, but also on security issues. It is a major backer of political warfare against democratic governments throughout the Americas. This is something that ought to concern every democracy in this hemisphere. It also trades with North Korea, including trade in arms, and this isn't some remnant from a distant communist past. This happened earlier this year. The State Department itself, in fact, sanctioned North Korean companies, North Korean ships for involvement in an illicit arms trade with Cuba in violation of UN arms agreements. Cuba, and this is, of course, the big thing, it's not that Cuba wants an embassy, an American embassy on its soil. It wants off the U.S. terrorist list, and that's what's probably coming after Obama's announcement.
But they'll trade with anyone precisely because you boycott. Look, I'm not saying Cuba is a perfect society. What I think of Cuba is, I believe when it comes to welfare and medicine and economic well-being of their people, they're doing relatively well. When it comes to basic freedoms, they're appalling. But you give hundreds of millions of dollars to Pakistan, which is a genuine sponsor of international terrorism. You have an alliance with Saudi Arabia, which is backing most of the Islamic violence that occurs in the world. It's pretty rich to say that little Cuba is a major problem for the United States.
But it is a problem throughout this hemisphere. There's no doubt about it. It's the major backer of the FARC, for example. It's waged a half-century war against Colombia. It is the hinterland for the FARC, by and large. It's where the FARC's leadership hangs out. Cuba is involved in has been involved in terrorist planning here in the United States, including trying to shoot down civilian airplanes. So also I have to say, there's no economic liberalization in this. This is dead on arrival in the Congress, and there isn't even a proposal to remove the U.S. trade embargo on Cuba. That will stay as part of law, and it's not something Obama can do away with.
Isn't it just because America was humiliated by a very small country, and you've never quite forgiven them for that?
No, it's because this is a despotic regime that imprisons 11 million Cubans, because it does absolutely atrocious things to them, because it causes security problems throughout the hemisphere, because it is a terrorist-sponsoring nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the reasons.
11 million?
Also, the entire population of Cuba, if you look, they have absolutely no freedoms. Freedom of assembly, freedom of press, freedom of religion. All of that is abrogated by the Korean government. And also, if you look, everywhere in this hemisphere, if you are on the side of freedom, if you are trying to improve your nation, try and make the government more accountable, whether you are in Cuba or Venezuela or in Nicaragua, you are discouraged by this. You're discouraged by the leader, the ostensible leader of the free world, once again reaching out to the dictators, not to the people who are trying to make the world better.
Look, Christian, I love the United States, and generally I'm on your side in things. I'm sorry, I really cannot hate this. You have supported dictatorships, particularly in Latin America. You have alliances now with countries I've just mentioned that are really unsavory. I understand realpolitik. Sometimes you have friends who shouldn't be. But I do not interpret Cuba as being a major threat. And I think by opening up some sort of relationship, you actually could empower those who want to liberalize. It's quite difficult to be oppressive when you have a lot of tourists coming in from the freest democracy in the world.
Well, that's just not so. Look at China. I mean, the whole story with China was that economic and diplomatic engagement would act as some sort of reformatory and that democracy would flow inevitably. In fact, this is Henry Kissinger's entire career was staked on it, and it is completely false. U.S. trade and engagement with China has only facilitated repression in that country. It's gotten worse, not better.
What?
And we've allowed it to become this massive security threat, both to the United States and, frankly, to every Pacific country, including Canada. Economic engagement by itself does not lead to liberalization politically. I
think China is much freer and much better than it was. It has a long way to go, but I think it's certainly improved from the country that was. But we also heard that the Vatican, and very similar in many ways, the Canadian government was part of the behind-the-scenes deal here. Did you know about that?
I did read that today. I think that's also unfortunate. These governments, which actually do have a pretty good record of standing for freedom, standing with those who want to choose their destiny, and rather than have it chosen for them by a communist autocracy, you know, we ought to be supporting those people throughout this region and not making deals with the thug regime that incarcerates its entire population.
So you really would want a foreign policy that is based on only having good, friendly relationships with countries that are thriving democracies?
No, I think there are, of course, countries that we've dealt with and deal with today that don't have good human rights records. The question is whether they are the type of government that can be reformed. And the U.S. has a great history of pushing certain types of governments in the direction of reform. If you look at countries like Portugal, like Taiwan, like Spain, like South Korea, like the Philippines, all military dictatorships that we successfully, I think, along with a lot of help from their own people, the majority of help from their own people, pressured towards freedom and accountability. But it's never happened with a communist government unless you replace it. Same with Islamist government today. And that's why I am completely fine partnering with loathsome regimes, repressive regimes in places like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, because over time they can be reformed and they are helping us defeat the unreformable, the Islamist. Right. Same in the Cold War.
I'm struggling to think how Portugal under Salazar was reformed with American help. It seems to me there was a strong socialist revolutionary movement that was not liked by the United States. However, that was some years ago. Has the American government put pressure on Pakistan, one of its main allies fighting the Taliban, to remove the blasphemy law?
I don't know specifically, and frankly, this is an administration in Washington, the Obama administration, that's completely deprecated human rights. It was Hillary Clinton who went to China and said, we can't let human rights get in the way of the climate crisis and the economic crisis.
You know, look, I have no time for the foreign policy of this government. I think it's been very weak. I have little time for Hillary Clinton's foreign policy approach either. But President Bush, I have no memory of any example where he pressurized the Pakistani government. He was more intent on having an alliance and an ally fighting the Taliban. I understand that. I suppose I have little patience for the double standard, for saying that Cuba is a major problem and other countries that are far bigger and far worse can be our friends. I just want fair play all around. Maybe I'm naive.
Well, the onus is on Obama to say how his decision today makes the world safer for the United States and our allies, or helps anyone other than the thugs who run Cuba. And it doesn't. It's not going to help the people in Cuba who want a better life or a freer life. It's not going to help our country to have more contact and money and engagement go to this Cuban government that trades arms with North Korea, supports insurgents throughout the Americas, et cetera, exports dictatorship. So the onus is on him to prove why this makes things better. Hasn't made it to the public, certainly hasn't made it to Congress. You know, there's not going to be a U.S. ambassador to Cuba. I can tell you that right now. No way the U.S. Senate confirms one. Obama's policy is, for all intents and purposes, not going to last very long.
Yeah, I think you could well be right on that. Appreciate the time and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.
And let us know what you think. I suspect a lot of people watching have been to Cuba. People I work with have been to Cuba. They have a different idea about that country, but we want to hear from you. Email thearena@somemedia.ca. You can chat to me on Twitter, which is @MichaelCoren. That's the handle. There's a lot more of The Arena still to come.